Hello and welcome to our next lesson in this survey of Genesis that we're going through. This is lesson 17 and I've entitled it Homeward Bound, part 2. We're going to, with this lesson, kind of complete the journey of Jacob. The next lesson will sort of wrap up the focus being on Jacob and his family and transition into the focus being on Jacob's sons and particularly his son Joseph. So it's been a pleasure for me to do these 4 lessons with you, and I think Quentin has the next one. Look forward to that as well. Just once again, a reminder of context. Jacob's about 97 years old as we're reading these events, as he leaves Haran, flees his father-in-law Laban. In our last story, makes the covenant with Laban. You stay in your place, I'll stay in my place. We're not going to harm one another, and I promise to treat your daughters well. And so now it's time for Jacob to move into Canaan, right? He's been in this area of the Gilead up until this point. But before he can do that, before he can move into Canaan, he's got to confront Esau. You know, it's been 20 years since he left the homeland, with Esau's threat sort of ringing in his ears, in the back of his mind, that says, you know, as soon as our dad passes away, you're a dead man. Interestingly, Isaac is still alive. Isaac and Rebekah are both still alive. I assume that Jacob knows that that's the case. Nevertheless, Jacob is really afraid of Esau, and he remembers the threat that was made. And so he's got this confrontation that he's probably been thinking about for 20 years. You know, I'm eventually going to have to come face to face with Esau. And so in our last lesson, he had set up this whole stage, right? How am I going to meet my brother? And regardless of where he was when he talked to Laban, if he's kind of up here in this general area east of the Jordan River, or if he was already down here in the southern part of this area of Gilead, just south of the Sea of Galilee, we do know that it's in this area that this confrontation is going to occur, because this river that's mentioned, Jabbok, is right here, just southeast of the Sea of Galilee, and flows into the Jordan River. So, you know, this is the area where these things are going to happen. The places that are mentioned in the last lesson, the Mahanaim, the second camp, and a couple of places that we're going to see in this lesson are down here. So we're going to assume that Jacob and his 2 camps are down in this area, and his brother Esau is coming up from the south, from this area of Edom, to travel up and meet Jacob. And Esau is bringing 400 of his closest friends along for the party. Jacob interprets that as an army coming to confront. Jacob has set his servants with a lot of gifts in the form of lots and lots of livestock to meet Esau on the path, and set his 2 camps up here, so that if it's an army that's going to attack, then perhaps one of the camps will survive that attack. That's Jacob's plan. You know, it's got a plan A and a plan B. So plan A is going to happen in that the servants are going to meet Esau as Esau and his group is coming back up. And this Jabbok River that's right here plays a central part in that as it feeds into the Jordan. So this is kind of the area that we're talking about. Picking up the story where we left off, right? The cliffhanger. Well, before we're going to get to that, we have this really interesting interaction, one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible. And if you're looking at just sort of stories of the Old Testament, and there's 50 stories in there, the ones you're most likely going to see about Jacob are the vision in his dream about the ladder, and you're probably going to see this one, and then ultimately you'll probably see him and Joseph in the coat of many colors, right? So these are kind of the big ones. So here's this big story that happens. Jacob sets his plan in motion, and he sets himself to be by himself. So the last thing that he does is he takes his two wives, his 2 female servants, or his other wives, and then he takes his 11 children, and he crosses the ford of the Jabbok River. So that map that we saw, he crosses that over, and so he's heading south, and next thing he's going to have to cross is the Jordan River to get into Canaan. But now he's nothing really between him and Esau and Esau's group. Okay. He took them and he sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. So all of his property, livestock, all of it. And presumably instructions on exactly how to set up the two camps or to join the camps that were already set up. And so he sent his family across. And that leaves him alone on the other side of this Jabbok River, all by himself. It says Jacob was left alone. And then it says a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day, which by itself is a really interesting single sentence about this. Like, we'd love to know exactly how this happened. This guy just shows up, and is Jacob asleep? Is he awake? Is it too dark for him to recognize? We don't have any of that color. We just find out that this man shows up. Jacob's alone. A man shows up, and they wrestle until dawn. Okay? And this wrestling is happening for however long it happens. And it says, when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. So it sounds like more than a touch, but nevertheless, if it was a touch, it was a touch that imparted a severe injury, because a dislocated hip is no small matter. Despite the fact that he has a dislocated hip, Jacob continues at 97 years old to wrestle with this man, with his injury and all. And he says to the man, the man says, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And Jacob says, or the man says, what's your name? Which is interesting, because Jacob is presuming that this is a spiritual being. In fact, he's presuming this is God in sort of an incarnate way that he's wrestling with. That's his assumption. And so for the man to say, tell me your name is odd. But that's what he says, please tell me your name. And Jacob, and he said, Jacob, my name is Jacob. And then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? I think, in other words, you really know who you're dealing with here, right? So this whole interaction is, first off, it's a very unique encounter with God. Similar in some respects to maybe the encounter that his grandfather Abraham had with God, where there was God incarnate in human form. But it's also like a drama or a play, maybe an object lesson, you might call it, where God is trying to tell Jacob something, and he's trying to tell him something through action, right, through this object lesson. And the message is, you have your whole life been wrestling, striving with both God and man, which is a true statement. Literally since birth, Jacob has been wrestling with or striving with man, starting with his own brother, right? Grasping the heel. And then wrestling with his brother over power within the family. Who gets the birthright? Who gets the blessing? And since then, constant striving and wrestling with fellow man, with his wives, with his family, with his father-in-law. And during that whole time, there's a wrestling that's happening, a spiritual aspect to it, that he's wrestling with God too. Striving with God over what God has promised to do through him, the promises that he's made, the vows that Jacob has made to God, Jacob reminding God of the promises. There's this constant friction in Jacob's life. And so the first thing that the man is going to do to Jacob is to say, your name is going to remind you of your nature and of this friction. That it literally means to strive. It means to strive with God. It also could mean God strives with you in a positive way, right? Staying engaged with you, wrestling with you, continuing to work with you despite the fact that you make a lot of mistakes and you have a lot of character flaws. Either way, it's a promise, and it's also a reminder to both Jacob and to everyone who's going to come to know him as Israel that friction is a part of his life, right? It also could, and I think is, a fork in the road moment for Jacob, right? That this encounter is meant to bring Jacob to a point where he knows he has a choice. This is the way I've lived, right? I've lived this way where I'm constantly striving with people in my life. I'm constantly striving with God. My relationships end up being a mess. My relationships with my family, my relationship with God. And I have an opportunity with a new name to make a new start, right? Right now, at this very moment, with what's going to happen this day as dawn breaks. And I think God is leading him to that fork in the road. So, he has a choice. One choice leads to shalom, or peace. Peace in your human relationships. Confrontation with Esau, perhaps. An opportunity to reconcile, absolutely. Opportunity to follow God's instructions and make his way back to his homeland where Isaac and Rebekah live and be back with his kindred and heal relationships that were broken. All of those opportunities and choices lay in front of him. Or continue on the path that you're on, which is the path of strife and wrestling and relationship drama and destruction. So that's his choice, okay? Possibly the path of shalom could have been to call off the whole plan B and go meet Esau face to face, personally, one-on-one, man-to-man, brother-to-brother, and to say what needs to be said, which is an apology for the deceit. But unfortunately, Jacob doesn't really follow that path. Remember, Isaac and Rebekah are still alive. So if Esau was going to take out his threat on Jacob, it would have to be with Isaac and Rebekah still alive rather than waiting for Isaac to be gone. So that should have given Jacob some comfort. But he's going to proceed, right? And so the encounter happens, right? And what's happened as Esau has moved up from the south is that he keeps coming across these servants and all of the livestock and all the things that Jacob sent out there ahead of them, right? And so Jacob gets out ahead of his family, but behind the servants that have kind of been out there, and he finally sees Esau. And as he approaches Esau, he's bowing 7 times, showing his respect and humility and acknowledging his brother's position, and most likely signaling that he's wanting to not have confrontation until he comes near his brother. And then here's the way that it actually unfolds, right? It says, Esau ran to meet him. So you can sort of see him running out ahead of this big group of people that he's bringing, almost 400 men, ran out to meet Jacob and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him and wept. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." Then the servants drew near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah likewise with her children drew near and bowed down, and last Joseph and Rachel drew near, and they bowed down. Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" Jacob said, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Jacob said, "No, please, if I found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me. Please accept my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." Thus he urged him, and he took it. So this is a beautiful scene, right? And we think about Esau being a bad guy in this story. And, threatening to kill Jacob, and the character that Esau had, which was that he didn't consider his birthright worth more than the pot of stew and things like that. And even the blessing that Isaac gave him, talking about the kind of man he's going to be and the kind of people that he's going to create. Rough, superficial, all those things. But in the 20 years that have passed, apparently Esau has been blessed as well. And he has lots of children and wives and flock, and he's wealthy in his own right. He doesn't really need anything from Jacob, but he does accept the gift, and he accepts the humility, and you see reconciliation. You think, all right, the story's turning. The brothers can be brothers again, and reconciliation has occurred, and that is a really, really good thing. But I want to call our attention back to what God said specifically to Jacob, right? Yahweh said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. Those are some very specific things, right? Return to the land, the promised land, Canaan, at least in general, probably specifically the part where they lived, and to your kindred, which would be Isaac, Rebekah, and Esau. Okay, those are the two parts. Do those two things, and I'll be with you. Well, where is kindred? His kindred are down here. They're in this area from Beersheba to Hebron. That's where they live. Bethel is where Jacob established the presence of God, set up the altar. So you would think that returning to the land of your kindred and to your kindred would be here, or at the very least up in Bethel, right? That should be the target. That's where he should be headed, okay? So one option that he has, and what Esau is going to ask him to consider, is to follow Esau down to where Esau lives, right? Right down here in this area of Edom, which is at least in the neighborhood where Isaac and Rebekah are, and from that place could cross over at the bottom of what is now the Dead Sea. I don't know what it's like at this point in time. Sodom and Gomorrah were presumably in this area, and they're gone. But I don't know if the Dead Sea's formed. But nevertheless, they could make the crossing and be over to Isaac or Rebekah's neighborhood pretty quick, right? That's what Esau's going to do, issue an invitation. Come with me, follow Esau, and meet mom and dad from there. And possibly have one big, huge family reunion, right? Maybe Esau and Jacob are going to make the trip over to see mom and dad, and they all get to reconcile. Rebekah gets to apologize for her part in it. Jacob's going to apologize to Isaac for deceiving him and taking away Esau's birthright. This could turn out to be a great thing, right? Big family reunion. It also could turn out to create linkage between the people of this area, Esau's family and his descendants, and the descendants of Isaac and Jacob. That could have been a really great blessing as well. Well, that's not how it's going to work. So Esau says, let us journey on our way. I'll go ahead of you. He's talking about headed back down south to where Esau lives. Jacob says to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail, the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they're driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me and at the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir. So another deception, right? He says to Esau, look, I can't travel as fast as you can because I have all these children and flocks and things. So we're slow, and we need to go slow in order to take care of all these people and flocks. But I'm going to move slow, and I'm going to come join you where you live. So Esau comes back and says to him, got it, understand, that makes total sense. Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me, presumably to help, and to escort them through, some pretty rough terrain to get back to Edom. I think Esau is genuine in his offer, I think. And then Jacob said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. In other words, I've got plenty of people to take care of this group. I don't need any more help, you head on back, and I'll meet you there, right? And so it says, so Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. It's another one of those choices in Jacob's life. He has a choice to trust both Esau, that he's genuine in his being happy to meet Jacob and weeping in that situation, that's all genuine. Trust Esau. And if you don't trust Esau, then trust God, because God gave him very specific instructions. Head back to the land of your kindred and your kindred, which at least means Isaac and Rebekah, and most likely also means Esau, and that I will be with you, which means that God's going to take care of it, right? That would have been the moment to make that decision. But Joseph journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house and made booths for his livestock. Therefore, the name of this place is called Succoth. So, Succoth is right on the Jordan River. He sets up camp there. He doesn't do what he said he was going to do, which is to follow Esau slowly. Instead, he sort of sets up temporary residence. And then from that perspective, he looks across the Jordan into Canaan and sees some pretty nice territory and decides to set up house there. Okay. Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Paddan Aram. So he passed through the place on the way up. He's passed through it on the way back, should have. But instead of passing through, he camped there. And he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he brought for 100 pieces of silver the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohi Israel. So what Jacob is doing is he's putting down roots, right? He bought a piece of land. He's going to settle right there. He's not with his kindred. He's not with Esau. He's not with Isaac and Rebekah. And he's surrounded by a bunch of Japhethite, descendants of Japheth, heathens. So he's in no better position than he was in Haran, where they were surrounded by that heathen culture. He's going to be surrounded by this Canaanite heathen culture. And more importantly, his whole family is also surrounded in the same area, right? They don't have the protection and the influence of Jacob's kindred, right? I don't know what kind of man Esau was and his relationship with God, but we know about Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob's family would have been in a really good spot if they had just gone down to Beersheba and Hebron and set up camp there, which is, I think, what God had in mind when he specifically told him, go to the land of your kindred and to your kindred. So Jacob's only doing half of what God asked him to do. And what that does is it takes the other fork in the road, which sets Jacob up for more wrestling, more dysfunction, and more tragedy. And we talked about patterns that Jacob has. He tends to be passive rather than proactive. So this is just kind of the path of least resistance. Just a little bit more mileage and you're to a place that's pretty nice territory, set up camp, put down some roots. He tends to proceed from a human rather than godly perspective when making decisions. This is him doing that again. Keeps me out of potential conflict with Esau. I'm just going to settle here. He's down there. We're up here. Everything's going to be fine. He tends to trust in temporal power and wealth rather than godly power. So he has to buy the land. It's not enough just to be there. He's going to have to, go buy it and put his trust in the deed that he has to the property. And then when things don't go right, he still complains. So once again, Jacob is a flawed man. He's a flawed husband. He's a flawed father. And aren't we all imperfect men and women? And so there are some lessons for us to learn from this story. The first 5 are the ones that we've seen from the last 5 lessons. And as I pass the baton over to Quentin, he'll no doubt have some different lessons to pull from his passage that he's going to cover as we transition from the spotlight being on Jacob to the spotlight turning to be on Jacob's sons, and particularly on Joseph. But I think it's worth just continuing to reiterate that we shouldn't presume that our way or man's way is God's way. And he has an ability to work his perfect plan through us, despite us, with us. It's our choice. that we have the opportunity to learn from the successes and failures of those that precede us. We need to recognize, acknowledge, and remember that our perspective, our human perspective, is often superficial. If we're not careful, we're going to miss the big message, the big picture, what God intends us to see, because godly perspective is spiritual. And so we need to look deeper than just what the superficial situation may tell us. In the situation with Jacob and Esau, he's thinking superficially about something that happened 20 years before and not necessarily listening to what God's trying to tell him. Sometimes God will take us to a fork in the road moment. He'll bring us to a place where there's a clear decision to make. And when that happens, when we encounter a fork in the road, we should pray for wisdom. When we pray for wisdom, God says He's going to grant us wisdom. We should seek godly counsel, find brothers and sisters that we can trust to ask, what's your advice? What should I do in the moment? And hopefully they'll give us godly counsel. We should pray for discernment, for God to help us recognize the fork in the road in the first place, that it is, but also to take the right path. But sometimes He will take us to a fork in the road to allow us to make a decision for Him or a decision not for Him. So we should recognize that. And we should also remember that we can always change our mind and retreat if we choose the wrong path. Sometimes the absolute best thing to do in a situation is to retreat, step back. If we find ourselves on the wrong path, we can go back. We can go back to that fork in the road. And God is so gracious that He'll meet us there at that old fork in the road and give us a chance to make a new decision. Doesn't mean there aren't going to be consequences from taking the wrong fork, as we often do. God promises to work His plan even through our poor decisions, which He demonstrates in Jacob's life over and over and over again. Jacob makes a bad decision. God blesses Jacob. He takes care of Jacob. He works His plan through Jacob. Jacob still suffers consequences over and over and again. But the biggest message of, I think, Jacob's life that we should take away is that ultimately, God will redeem us from our bad decisions if we trust Him. We're going to make bad decisions. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to sin. But God sent His Son to take on the burden of our bad decisions, our mistakes, our sins for us, so that we can be in relationship with Him. And ultimately, we can reach our promised land, which is our place in heaven, seeing God's face, seeing Him face to face. And that's the ultimate hope that we have, is that our trust in Him, despite what this life brings and the consequences, the chickens coming home to roost, that He's going to redeem us from all of that and have Him with us in His presence. So we look forward to that. I also look forward to Quentin's lesson next time. So in preparation for that, read Genesis 34 through 36. Find out a little bit more about Esau. Esau's family actually has power and wealth that outstrips what Jacob has. There's kings that are going to be in Edom way before there are kings that are going to be amongst the Israelites. And the story of Edom carries through all the way to Jesus. Herod the Great, a descendant of Esau. Fascinating just to think about the way that unfolds throughout the history of these people of Jacob, people of Israel. So look forward to that.